scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner, but the food on the table began to move on its own. The carrots wriggled like worms, the potatoes pulsed with a faint, internal light, and the peas rolled off the plate and scurried across the floor like tiny, green insects. The familiar aroma of cooking was replaced by a strange, earthy smell, mixed with something sweet and sickly. Peppa and George watched in horror as the vegetables began to coalesce, forming a grotesque, pulsating mass in the center of the table. It grew larger, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, with two glowing green eyes emerging from its surface. Mummy Pig, her back turned, continued to hum, oblivious to the monstrous transformation occurring behind her. The kitchen grew cold, and the familiar sounds of cooking were replaced by a faint, squelching noise. The monstrous vegetable creature began to twitch, then to rise, its form dripping with a viscous, green liquid. It let out a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The familiar comfort of their home was replaced by a chilling sense of dread, as the food they were about to eat transformed into a living nightmare. The creature took a step, its root-like feet squelching on the tiled floor. It reached out a tendril, its glowing eyes fixed on Peppa. The house was no longer safe, for a monstrous hunger had awakened within its walls. The familiar comfort of their dinner time had become a terrifying encounter with a sentient, malevolent entity. The food was alive and it was hungry. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was helping Mummy Pig water the plants in the garden, but the flowers seemed to wilt and turn black as soon as the water touched them. The vibrant green leaves shriveled, and the colorful petals curled inward, revealing thorny, twisted stems. The soil beneath their feet began to crack and crumble, revealing not earth, but a dark, pulsating mass. A low, rhythmic thumping sound emanated from deep within the ground, like a giant heart beating. The air grew heavy with the scent of decay and something sweet, yet sickly. The familiar garden gnomes, usually so cheerful, now had vacant, staring eyes, their painted smiles frozen in a grotesque rictus. The garden, once a place of beauty and life, was transforming into a barren wasteland. The thumping grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. Dark, thorny vines erupted from the cracked earth, snaking their way around the wilting plants, their thorns dripping with a viscous, black liquid. The sun, usually so bright, was obscured by a thick, unnatural mist that rolled in from the edges of the garden. The sound of buzzing insects filled the air, but these were not ordinary bees. They were large, black, and their wings beat with an ominous hum. The garden shed, usually a place for tools, now seemed to pulse with an internal, sickly green light. The plants, once their friends, were now turning against them, their thorny branches reaching out like grasping claws. The garden was no longer a place of growth, but of consumption, slowly devouring everything in its path. The thumping intensified, and a large, dark maw opened in the center of the garden, revealing rows of jagged, crystalline teeth. The house, their home, felt miles away, and the garden had become a living, breathing nightmare. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. In the quiet of the night, Peppa was awakened by a strange scratching sound coming from inside her wardrobe. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around her. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like claws on wood. A thin sliver of light appeared under the wardrobe door, pulsing with a sickly green glow. Peppa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to call for Mummy and Daddy Pig, but her voice was caught in her throat. The wardrobe door creaked open, and a long, spindly shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her bed. The air in the room grew cold, and the familiar, cheerful wallpaper seemed to peel away, revealing dark, damp stone beneath. The green light spilled out, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Peppa could see two glowing red eyes in the darkness of the wardrobe, unblinking and malevolent. The shadow on the floor grew larger, taking the shape of a monstrous figure with long, sharp claws. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the room. The figure stepped out of the wardrobe, its form shifting and indistinct, a creature of nightmare. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its red eyes fixed on Peppa. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a cage, and the monster was the keeper. The moonlight streaming through the window was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The creature's growl rumbled through the room, a sound that vibrated in Peppa's very bones. It raised a clawed hand, its shadow falling over Peppa's bed. The world outside her window seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating darkness of the room and the terrifying presence of the monster. The last thing Peppa saw before she squeezed her eyes shut was the glint of sharp, white teeth in the monster's gaping maw. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Peppa discovered that her house had begun to grow, not bigger on the outside, but bigger on the inside, with new rooms appearing where there had been walls before. It started when she went to get a glass of water from the kitchen and found that the hallway between her bedroom and the kitchen had become twice as long as it used to be. The walls hadn't moved, and the doors were still in the same places. But somehow the distance between them had stretched. What used to be a few steps now took her almost a minute to walk. The hallway felt like it was pulling itself longer while she walked through it, like a rubber band being stretched by invisible hands. When she finally reached the kitchen, she found that it too had grown. The room was still the same shape, with the same furniture in the same places. But everything was farther apart. The refrigerator seemed miles away from the stove, and the kitchen table looked tiny in the middle of the vast space. Mummy Pig was cooking dinner, but she had to walk great distances between the counter and the stove. She didn't seem to notice anything unusual, humming cheerfully as she took long journeys across the enormous kitchen to fetch ingredients. When Peppa tried to tell her about the strange changes, Mummy Pig just smiled and said the kitchen had always been this size. Daddy Pig was in the living room, but the living room had become so large that Peppa could barely see him sitting on the purple sofa. He looked like a tiny figure in the distance, reading his newspaper in the middle of a vast empty space. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if he was calling from across a canyon. George's bedroom had grown the most. When Peppa opened the door, she found herself looking into what seemed like an endless space. George was playing with his block somewhere in the distance, so far away that she could barely make out his small figure. His dinosaur noises echoed strangely in the enormous room, bouncing off walls that seemed impossibly far away. The most unsettling part was that as the rooms grew larger, her family seemed to be getting smaller. Not physically smaller, but somehow less significant, like tiny dolls in a giant dollhouse. Their voices became fainter. Their movements seemed slower, and they appeared more and more distant even when they were standing right next to her. Peppa tried to run from room to room, but each journey took longer than the last. The stairs to her bedroom, which used to take seconds to climb, now felt like climbing a mountain. Each step echoed in the vast stairwell, and by the time she reached the top, she was exhausted and out of breath. Her own bedroom had become a cavern. Her bed sat in the middle of an enormous space, looking like a tiny island in an ocean of carpet. Her toys were scattered across distances that would take minutes to walk, and her closet was so far away that she could barely see it in the dim light. When she looked out her bedroom window, she saw that the outside world had remained the same size. The other houses looked normal. The trees were the right height, and the street was the proper width. Only her house had grown on the inside, becoming a maze of oversized rooms connected by endless hallways. As the night went on, the house continued to expand. Peppa found herself getting lost in rooms she had known all her life. The bathroom was now so large that she couldn't find the light switch. The closets had become deep caves that she was afraid to enter. Even the smallest spaces, like the cupboard under the stairs, had grown into vast chambers. The episode ended with Peppa sitting alone in the middle of her enormous bedroom, listening to the distant sounds of her family going about their evening routines in rooms that had become so large they might as well have been different countries. She realized that even though they all lived in the same house, they were now so far apart that they might never truly be together again, each of them isolated in their own vast spaces, calling to each other across distances that grew larger with every passing moment. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Sunday afternoon at the Pig family house, and everyone was taking their usual nap. Peppa woke up first, but the house was strangely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a lazy Sunday, but an empty, hollow silence that made her ears ring. She went to check on George in his room, but his bed was perfectly made as if no one had ever slept in it. His toys were arranged in neat rows, all facing the door, as if they had been watching and waiting for someone to enter. The dinosaur toy that George loved so much was sitting on the pillow, but its plastic eyes seemed to follow Peppa as she moved around the room. Mummy and Daddy Pig's bedroom was the same. The bed was made. Their clothes were folded perfectly, and everything was in its exact place, but there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. No wrinkled sheets, no books left open, no glasses on the nightstand. It was as if they had simply vanished. Peppa called out for her family, but her voice echoed strangely in the house. Instead of the normal echo that bounced off walls, her voice seemed to stretch and distort, coming back to her as whispers from different rooms. The whispers sounded like her family's voices, but they were saying things she had never heard them say before. She went downstairs to the kitchen, and found that dinner was already prepared on the table, for plates with steaming food, as if someone had just finished cooking. But the food was wrong. It looked like their usual meals, but the colors were too bright, the shapes too perfect, like plastic food from a toy kitchen set. The living room felt enormous. The purple sofa seemed miles away from the television, and the ceiling stretched up higher than it should have. Peppa's footsteps echoed loudly on the floor, but when she looked down, she couldn't see her feet. The green carpet seemed to ripple and move like water beneath her. The photographs on the walls had changed. They still showed the pig family, but in each picture, one family member was missing. In some photos, George wasn't there. In others, Daddy Pig had vanished. And in a few, Peppa herself was absent from family moments she remembered being part of. As evening approached, the house began to fill with sounds, footsteps in the hallway, but no one was there. Voices having conversations in empty rooms, the sound of George playing with his toys upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, the room was still empty and silent. The telephone started ringing, but every time Peppa answered it, the line was dead. The television turned on by itself, showing programs she had never seen before. They looked like episodes of her own life, but with small differences. In these episodes, she was an only child, or her parents looked slightly different, or the house had extra rooms she had never seen. By nighttime, Peppa realized she might be completely alone in the house, but the house itself seemed to be trying to convince her that her family was still there. Plates appeared and disappeared from the kitchen table. Beds became unmade and then made themselves again. Lights turned on and off in patterns that seemed almost like a code. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in her bedroom, listening to the sounds of a family that might not exist anymore, while the house around her continued its elaborate performance of normal life, trying to keep her from realizing that she might be the only real thing left in a world that was slowly becoming as artificial as a dollhouse. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's playroom had always been her favorite place in the house, filled with colorful toys and games that brought her joy. But tonight, as she entered to retrieve a forgotten book, the room felt different. All of her toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward as if they were having a meeting. The toy telephone was off its hook, emitting a soft dial tone that filled the room with an eerie hum. Her stuffed animals sat upright with their button eyes all turned toward the same spot, the empty space in the center of their circle. As Peppa watched, the toys began to move closer together, tightening their circle with small, jerky movements. The toy piano began to play a melody by itself, its keys depressing with invisible fingers, creating a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. Her building blocks started to stack themselves into towers that defied gravity, balancing in impossible configurations that should have fallen but didn't. The jack-in-the-box began to turn its handle slowly, the tinny music playing at half speed, creating an ominous countdown to something terrible. Peppa tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The toys all turned to look at her simultaneously, their painted faces seeming more alive than they had any right to be. The stuffed animals' button eyes began to glow with a soft, sickly light, and their stitched mouths appeared to move as if they were trying to speak. The jack-in-the-box finally popped open, but instead of the usual clown, a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa emerged, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. The toy Peppa pointed at the real Peppa and opened its mouth in a silent scream, and all the other toys began to move toward her, their movements becoming more fluid and lifelike with each step. The room filled with the sound of mechanical laughter, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of madness that seemed to come from the toys themselves.